as you heard, this is our second last session, and it's on finances. I think that's what might have attracted people to come along, but I do want to explain that we're not giving away finances during the session. We're just talking about it. We do have a competition each month for the most colourful, messiest, most impressive placemat that is coloured in or added to or played with during the session. And this month I've got a bag full of gold coins for the winner.
And our usual winner's not here, so it's free for the taking.
It's an open competition. It's much more competitive tonight. It's like the Rugby World Cup when the favourite's knocked out. Anyone could win. Okay, so there's another little competition. It must be the Melbourne Cup in the air. But there's another little competition. On your tables, there's a little sheet of finance bingo. You'll find a whole lot of terms, most of which will ordinarily get mentioned tonight. So when they do, just say bingo, and you can cross that out on your card. And when you've crossed out all of them, then there's a prize. So but you say bingo for each one, so we're going to have lots of bingo. And if there are any that I haven't mentioned by the end, then to complete the table of terms, if you can define them, you can cross them out. So just have to define them for the group. Okay. So I think that's the main things I want to say for my introduction. So we're going to just start, because this is about governance and finance. It's not an accounting course. To try and identify what are the roles of the different people involved in finances in a not-for-profit organisation. So I'd like you to think about what are the roles of the board members, the treasurer, the chief staff person, if there is one, and if there are particular specialist finance staff or someone who does finance work as a paid or voluntary job. So you've got some cards in front of you, one set per table, so you'll need to crunch up a little bit to work as a table, and see if you can match those roles with their particular responsibilities of those people. Time's up. So the most important answer is, as Roosevelt says, the buck stops here. So the most important thing to know is that the buck for the finances does stop with the board. It doesn't stop with the treasurer, it doesn't stop with the manager. The board has the overall responsibility for what goes on in the finances. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like as we go through some of the particular roles that boards can play. And but just to emphasise that, some people did research on the government regulators of non-profits in America, and in America at a state level, so there's 52 different systems for regulating non-profits, and they interviewed all the different regulators about accountability lapses in non-profits, and they came up with quite a number of different ones, high-profile things like fraud and embezzlement, through to improper use of non-profit assets, misappropriation, mismanagement, and inefficient operation. The interesting things in themselves, which we're not going to go into tonight, but one of the things that they found was there were gaps, different gaps associated with different lapses, but there was one gap associated with every lapse, by and large, well not every, but most lapses. It was a recurring gap, and that gap was the lack of a strong and independent board. So the best way, if you want to ensure poor accountability, is make sure you don't have a strong and independent board. That's the one thing, the absence of that's most commonly associated with all kinds of accountability lapses, from the illegal to the improper. So when we try and divide up the roles, people usually allocate them this way, but there's lots of subtle differences in organisations depending on the size, depending on history, depending on the staffing or not that you've got. So obviously, if you don't have people doing these roles, someone has to do that, and they get shared around to other places. The key thing I do want to stress, though, at this point is that it's not all the treasurer's job. The treasurer has a role to help the board be responsible for the finances, not to take away the responsibility for the finances. So the whole board is responsible for what happens, and the whole board needs to have some level of involvement. They may not have the same detailed knowledge or expert knowledge, but they still need to have enough confidence about what's going on with the finances. That's really the most important thing there. Yep.
In your experience, what experience in financial matters does the average board have? Because most of them are well-meaning people, but they probably do not have a lot of detailed experience of financial matters.
Yes, that's true. And as I said, I think the biggest problem is when boards think it's okay, I don't know because we've got a treasurer and he knows or she knows. We'll talk about some of the basics as we go through, but I may have mentioned this before. I forget which group of people I mentioned it to. But there's actually one organisation who, when they recruit people for the board, they say you need to have a certain level of financial literacy sufficient to understand the reports and to exercise oversight. And they have an exam. So it's a very simple exam or test. But it's basically, so can the person look at the usual format of the reports and tell whether you're in a surplus or a deficit? Can they distinguish between budget and actuals and work out what the significance of that is? Can they tell? Right, okay, yes, good. You can cross that one off. Can they tell if the organisation is a going concern or not, or is it trading insolvently? So second bigger.
I've got a question. Is the treasurer usually part of the board or not?
Well, there are some organisations that don't have a treasurer. We think that we have this kind of heritage of assuming that you need to have a treasurer on the board, but especially in larger organisations where you've got quite a sophisticated financial staff, you don't necessarily have to have the same level of financial expertise on the board, but you do need the board to be happy to exercise a proper financial oversight. So sometimes the voluntary treasurer on the board is a way of helping other board members who might not have the same level of financial knowledge to exercise oversight. But whether you've got someone there or not, the board has to exercise oversight in the various matters that we've got 3.5 roles we're going to talk about later.
So if the finance staff are more doing the work,
They're doing all the reporting.
And the treasurer is not doing the ensures income and expenditures within budget and plans, which I thought the treasurer would be doing. What is the role? How do you define a treasurer? So,
yeah. Well, there is no single definition of a treasurer, basically. So the correct answer to that question is it depends. And it mostly depends on the size and the history of the organisation. In some organisations, the treasurer does this, maintains transactions and records source documents, because it may be an all-volunteer organisation, or a organisation that has maybe a limited number of staff who do service delivery or project work, not admin work. And someone has to do that.
And also maybe ensure their income.
Yes, yeah. So, although this is how it's often expressed in textbooks, it really changes depending on your own organisation. And as I said, it doesn't really matter too much which box those different roles get in. They all need to be done, and the board has to accept the overall oversight. They're the kind of key things, and not be. They can be helped by the treasurer, but not advocate for the treasurer. That's the big message.
So, in a way, the treasurer could be replaced by a subcommittee, or it could be a group of the board or executive who own that, not for necessarily operational, but for supporting the board notes.
Yes, yeah. And I'm on one board that I'm on. We don't have an official position of treasurer, but it's quite a big organisation, so there's quite a big finance department in the organisation, including our own internal audit, of that size. But we always make sure when we're recruiting board members, there's at least 2, if not 3, who have some more than the average person in the street's knowledge of finances, can understand accounting terms and can help finance that direction. But they don't have any other particular roles, like signing particular documents or anything that sometimes the treasurer has. But in some organisations, there's a very specific set of things that the treasurers do, and the less staff, the more the treasurers tend to do. Okay, so in exercising the oversight of the finances, there are some legal responsibilities that boards have. And again, they collectively have this responsibility, so the whole board is responsible. So whatever they do, they need to act in good faith. So they're doing this with good intentions. They need to comply with whatever legislation they're incorporated under and with their own constitution. So if there are certain procedures for how you do things, or whether you're allowed to take out a loan or not to take out a loan. Some constitutions have restrictions on that. Some constitutions have restrictions on assets you're allowed to own or not own. Then they need to comply with that. They need to exercise reasonable care and diligence in their decisions. And the way courts have interpreted this is the more expertise you have, the more is expected of you. So if you are an accountant on a board, you'll be expected to have a higher level of care and diligence about financial matters than a person who has no formal financial background. Everyone has responsible for reasonable care and diligence, but it escalates depending on your own skill and experience that you might have. Not act recklessly or create a substantial risk of loss to creditors in particular. So where the organisation owes money to someone, to make sure that you're doing all the reasonable things so that you can fulfil those obligations. So it's not that you can't take risks, but that you can't be reckless in those risks. The risks need to be reasonable, and you need to show that you've taken into account the level of risk. And absolutely not incur an obligation you couldn't expect to fulfil. So if there's no way you could do this contract, you should enter into it. If there's no way you can repay a loan, then you should take it out. So probably not many surprises in there. They're the kind of things that we would probably expect board members to do, and they're the kind of that's the legal minimum, the legal core. But often in practice, this is really about asking questions, so that the board members keep asking questions until it makes sense. So you should understand what's going on and feel happy with the level of risk of what's going on. And the key to that is to keep asking questions until it makes sense to you. What I'd like you to do, though, just for a minute, is to think of what are some of the financial questions that board members could ask. So I'm just thinking each table can come up with 2 questions about the finances that they might want to ask of themselves, looking at the accounts and the information they have available. So just in your table group, see if you can come up with a couple of questions that you might want to ask. Okay, so everyone got at least 2 questions you can ask? Great. So we'll just go around the table, and if someone's already asked that your question, give us the other one. If they've asked both your questions, bad luck. And maybe you've got a third. If you don't worry. So we'll start over here. What's one question that? How are we tracking against budget? So that's what we call actuals against budget. Yep. So what you're comparing is actual expenditure and actual income against budgeted expenditure and budgeted income. Great question. Fundamental one that most boards need to know pretty much every month when they're looking at the finances. Any other questions from table 2?
One I get quite frequently is how many members have paid up?
Right, how many members have paid up?
Yeah.
Yes. So and that has some non-financial issues as well. As, are people committed enough to the organisation that they're paying up? Are we attractive enough to a large enough number of organisations, or is there something else? If the number's not very good, and if it's an important source of income, you might particularly want to ask that. If that, financially speaking, if we put aside the participation questions, which are important in their own right, but financially speaking, if it was a minor source of income, it wouldn't be so important. So you'd want to focus on what are your major sources of income. So if your major source of income was grants, you probably want to know about how successful are we with our grants compared to last year. Who are we waiting on? Who said no? Whatever. If our major source of income was member fees, how are we tracking with payments? Have we got a large number unpaid? Great. Good question. Yep.
Have we got enough cash in the bank to pay the bill?
Have we got enough cash in the bank to pay the bill? Because even if we're going to budget, we may not actually have the cash in the bank. And we're going to talk about the difference between cash and accrual in a little while. But although often in accounting terms you have to take into account things other than cash, at the end of the day you pay people their wages in cash, you pay bills in cash, so you need to have the cash available. So that's an important issue.
And the other one.
Oh, no cheating. Only one question per table.
Oh.
You'll have another one in a minute, but we've got to give tables for it. Have they used up all of your questions?
No.
Yeah, you've got some more.
Is there a conflict of interest?
Is there a conflict of interest? Yes. So that's about assuring probity that people are behaving correctly in the spending decisions, the income decisions that you're making. You got any left?
I think we covered out the other one, which was are there any income streams at risk?
Yes. Great. Have you got any others that haven't been picked up already? No.
Are the creditors paid up to date?
Right, okay. So are we owing stuff? Are creditors paid? How much do we owe? Sometimes called liabilities. What we owe. Any more?
How does the non-financial and financial, how does the non-financial information compare with the financial? Are they going the same?
Oh, right, yeah. So are there any inconsistencies between what you're saying is happening?
Between reporting and what you're saying?
Yeah. That's a really important question because the finances are a part of the overall picture and they should be consistent with the program information, the participant information, those kind of things as well. So, if you're saying, we're doing fabulously successful, more and more people are coming along, more and more members joining our organisation, unfortunately we've got no money. Is there a good reason for that or does that not quite fit? Any other questions that people have?
No.
What are we going to do with our excess money?
What are we going to do with our excess money? Yeah. And one of the things you need to take into account there is it actually excess or does it just look excess? And that's what accrual accounting helps you to just identify. It takes into account all your liabilities as well as the assets that you have. And one of the peculiarities of not-for-profit accounting is we have this thing which is of marginal significance to most businesses, but which is core for many non-profits, called restricted income. We may receive income that can only be spent on a particular purpose. If you're running a shop and you sell ice creams, the income you get from selling those ice creams can be spent on anything. They don't have to be just spent on ice creams. But if you're running a not-for-profit and a donor gives you money for a training program, you are legally obliged to only spend that money on the training program. If that's because you raise money saying all the money you give us will be spent on X, then it has to be spent on X. Or if there's a contract and someone says, if you run this activity or buy this equipment, we will give you these dollars, then that money is restricted and can't be used legally for any other purpose, only that purpose. Sometimes organisations can get into real problems with that because you can have more money for a purpose that you don't want and not enough money for purposes that you do want. The most common form of that is funders in particular like funding projects and don't like funding admin and overhead costs to keep the organisation existing. So you can be fabulously successful with income, but actually not have enough money to pay the electricity if no one's paying the electricity. The overseas aid agencies often get into trouble where there are popular emergencies and there are unpopular emergencies. And they end up with more money for popular emergencies than they can actually usefully spend. So often what they do these days, and you'll see it in the fine print of a lot of fundraising campaigns, is please donate money to the Ethiopian drought or wherever it may be needed most. So that if they get more money for Ethiopian drought than they need, they can put it into other areas of their mission that are in need, but not as attractive. Okay, any other? Right, why it's Yeah. What's behind that? Yeah. Or why this year is it so different from last year? Yeah. So over time, it's a good thing to look at.
Balance sheets?
Yep.
Balance sheets?
Yes. Yep. And we're going to talk about balance sheets in a moment, which have got new fancy names in the last few years. But so these are some of the questions. I don't think we didn't talk about solvency, did we?
No.
You know what? What does solvency mean? Might be a bingo word. Yeah. So it basically is that we've got enough money to pay our obligations. Not just our legal debts, but our expected obligations, like in the next month. So you can say, well, we'll be solvent for next month, or we're solvent for the next 3 months, or whatever. Probably the other things are pretty straightforward. The other thing we haven't really talked about is investments or savings. So you said how we're going to use our savings, but sometimes it's also important to know how are we investing the current surplus before we use it for something else, or while we keep it as a cushion if something goes wrong. Okay, so that's not a comprehensive list, but it's just to remind us that the most important thing we can do in our financial oversight is ask questions and keep asking questions until we understand what's going on. And the most important 4 words I always say for a board member are, I don't get it. So that if you don't quite understand the answer, or if you don't quite understand the figures, to keep asking until you do get it. Because that goes back to our original responsibilities. We are legally responsible to exercise oversight, which means we legally need to get it. We need to understand it, and don't just think, oh well, everyone else is quiet, they must understand it, so I'll just be quiet too. Often that just means everyone else is embarrassed to ask as much as you are, so they may or may not get it, and so you can be doing them a favour if you keep asking the obvious questions, because it may not be as obvious to everyone. Oh, that's just the picture. Goes with I don't care. Because that's the alternative to asking. It's just to stick our head in the sand. Okay, so we're going to go through in a moment what I call the 3.5 roles that all boards need to exercise. I'll explain why there's a half in there. But before we do that, it's just worth reminding ourselves of the basic money go-round. What happens to money and finances in an organisation? And this is on our placemat as well. But just to go through it to remind us. So it starts over here with the transaction. So that's either money in or money out, or money around between different accounts. So the actual financial transaction occurs, and every financial transaction needs to be recorded in some way and have some source document to support it. So source documents are like invoices or receipts or records of transfer of funds between accounts. And then the information on those source documents, like the date, the amount, the purpose, are usually entered into some journal, which originally used to be manual, now is increasingly done in computer programs and often in the cloud. But somehow all of those source documents for every transaction needs to be entered into some record. And then those records need to be checked against the cash in the bank statements, the credit card statements, the check statements, so that you can see everything has actually been covered. So this is like a belts and braces or a first attempt to double check. You haven't forgotten anything or counted something twice. Both things are just as likely. You count the same thing twice or you forget it. Every time I do my accounts, I always at least find something I have counted twice or entered twice into the books. And then there are some particular end of the year adjustments which might need to be made. These are usually to help take into account what's called accrual accounting, which means you haven't received or paid out the cash yet, but you have a legal obligation to receive it or to pay it out. the short answer of that. And then there are statements out of that will be produced annual statements. And the two financial statements nowadays are called statements of financial performance and statement of financial position. That used to be the balance sheet and the income and expenditure.
Profit and loss.
Profit and loss, that's right, yes. I've almost forgotten what I used to call. But financial performance and financial position are what they're currently called. And we're going to have a look at some examples of those to make sure we understand them. Out of that will be produced what is now called the performance report, which is actually just your annual financial reports. And they may be audited or reviewed or just compiled. So there's different levels which we'll talk about briefly at the end. But that's the kind of money go round that happens, and boards have particular roles at different points. And as we mentioned already, in some boards, if it's an all-voluntary organisation, the treasurer may actually be doing steps 2 and 3 as well, but that's not essentially a board role. That could be done by another staff member or volunteer or someone else. Okay, so what are the 3.5 tools that help boards exercise oversight? So the first one, or 1.5, is financial planning and financial monitoring. So having a plan and monitoring it. So I call that 1.5. It's not quite 2, it's more than 1. That's my definition of 1.5. Then whatever financial controls we put in place so that the records are more likely to be a true and fair picture of what's actually happening, and then the reporting that we make to all the stakeholders about what's happening in the finances. And boards have particular responsibilities in each of those 3.5 areas, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of tonight on. Okay, so the first is in the responsibility for the budget. So the budget is the financial plan. And if you don't have a budget, you can't tell whether you're going to the plan. So you don't know whether what's happening is good, bad, or indifferent. Also, if you don't have a budget, you don't necessarily have an agreed direction that your finances are needing to run against, or benchmarks that you're wanting to achieve. So it's pretty fundamental to have a budget, even if it's, especially the first time a budget's developed for an organisation, you might end up finding that it was vastly different from what actually happened, because we're trying to guess things in advance. The more experience you've got, i.e. the longer the organisation's been around, or the longer it's running the same kind of activities, the more accurate you'd expect the budget to be, because you're basing it on past experience. But unless you've got something to start, you need to have something to start with, even if it's not absolutely accurate. And having the budget allows you to do the monitoring, because if you don't have a budget and you see that the income for the month was $42,000, is that good, bad, or indifferent? You've got no idea. So you need to compare it against something to know what it's, whether it's meeting targets or not meeting targets that you need to have. So the fundamental oversight here is the board needs to keep an eye. The board needs to both set the budget originally, with advice from the people involved in the spending and the income, and then monitor what's actually happening against that budget. So that's why most financial reports either do or should have at least 2 columns in them, what we budgeted to do in this area and what's actually happening in this area. Sometimes financial reports will have another column which says what happened last year, so that gives you another kind of point of comparison to see is what's happening particularly unusual. So if, for example, you budgeted to have membership income of $10,000 and your actual is $5,000, it might be handy to know that last year your actual was $5,000 as well. So it's not that you're going backwards, it's just that you haven't improved. And for some reason or other you thought you could double it and you can't. Sometimes they have even more columns, in that you will have the budget for the month and the actual for the month, and then the budget for the year to date and actual for the year to date as well. And then sometimes people will also have another column which is the budget for the total year, so you can see the overall year that you're heading towards. So essentially the more columns, the more sophisticated the information you're getting, the more important that is, especially the bigger you are, or the more your finances are likely to fluctuate, so that you can keep an eye on things. It's a trade-off between comprehensiveness and complexity. Obviously, the less columns, the simpler it is to just keep an eye on a few key things, but the more columns, the more comprehensive the information you have. So what I'd like you to do is just to share on the table what form does your information come in? Can you remember? And do you feel like at the moment you've got too much information that's too complex, or not enough information that's not comprehensive enough, or just right, Goldilocks? So just have a discussion about what kind of information you regularly get in your organisation, and too much, not enough, just right. Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple more questions in your groups. So there's just a pause button rather than the stop button on those discussions. Who uses an accounting software in their organisation? Most people do. Yeah, that's pretty much the norm these days. Who uses Xero? MYOB? Anyone else? So, yep. So, Xero is the New Zealand one, MYOB is the Australian one, which came out first. They're both fairly widespread, and the big advantage is that just about every accountant in Australia and New Zealand knows them and is very familiar with them and happy to operate with them, and has confidence in them and knows how to use them. So that's great. That's automated a lot of the processes, and it means we can actually be much more tailored in the reports that we want as well, because they both give you a fair degree of flexibility in reporting. I just wanted to talk about a little bit about budgeting. So budgeting is setting what we expect to spend and what we expect to get as income, and what we expect the difference to be. Basically, those three things. And we may also have policies about any one of those things. So we may have policies about what we will and will not spend money on. We may have policies about where we will and will not accept money from. And we may have policies about what we want the difference to be between income and expenditure. Just starting from the end, we might have a policy that we want every year to our income to at least equal our expenditure, and that we want to have in reserves unrestricted funds equivalent to 6 months of operating costs, so that we've got a buffer if something should go wrong. So most organisations will once they get to a certain level of stability, start to think about what a reserves policy is for them. Because not-for-profit doesn't mean we have to always balance with a zero surplus each year. And there is a reason for having reserves. They are to invest in the organisation. So if we want to spend on capital, or if we want to expand in order to attract more funding, those kind of investments require reserves. But also, we can have reserves to absorb any sudden shocks, like the loss of an expected source of income. So we've at least got 3 months or 6 months, that kind of common targets that people set themselves. But the range is enormous. Some organisations say we're aiming to have 2 years operating costs in the bank. Others say we're happy we've got 1 month operating costs in the bank, and all points in between. Partly depends on the stability of your income and your own level of appetite for risk. There's no right or wrong answer there. Though I would say probably 3 to 6 months is fairly common, and unless you're a very secure organisation or a very risky one. But in the end, it is up to you. Policies about where we accept income from could be ethical, like we will not accept income from gambling sources because we deal with the problems of gambling, or something like that, or we won't accept money from companies that produce alcohol because we deal with the problems of alcohol. Or it could also be prudential, or a judgment about we don't want more than half our money to come from government grants because we don't want to be too reliant on government grants. We want to earn the rest. So, or we want to make sure that no single source of income is more than 10% or whatever. So both those kind of policy, ethical and prudential kind of policies you can have about income sources. Expenditure types, what you will and will not spend money on, really is enormously variable. It's infinitely variable depending on the kind of organisation that you are. I can't think of any kind of generic examples in there, but you may have some in your own organisation where you have things you will and will not spend money on. A minor example, I know some organisations won't spend money on alcohol at events. They usually much more significant things than that. So you set the budget up in order to track how you're going along. You can also compare with last year, and in the absence of a budget, last year is actually your de facto budget. People tend to treat it the same. So I say to those kind of organisations, well, why don't you call last year's actual your current year's budget if you're treating it like that, if you're always comparing it against that. Okay, so another question I just want to ask you is whether you've come across the distinction between cash accounting and accrual accounting, and if so, what is the difference? What's the difference between these two? So have a bit of a discussion. Finish off anything that you haven't quite finished off in the group, and then see if you can come up with an answer about cash versus accrual from your table. Okay. Well, just check in with who's heard of cash versus accrual before? A couple of people. So, of those who've heard of it, anyone know what it means?
Yeah. So accruals when you basically post all of your invoices, whether they're sales or purchases, onto the system, you post your accounting on that. Yeah. As opposed to cash where you would base it on when the money actually comes in or goes out.
Yes, yeah. So it's basically just about when you count the money. So if you're doing cash accounting, you only count it either in or out when the cash actually goes in or out of your bank account, when you make a payment or receive the cash. If you're doing accrual, then you count it as soon as the obligation is entered into. So if you sell something to someone and they owe you money for it, the moment they agree to pay you is when you count it. You don't have to wait till you get the cash. If you owe someone some money, the moment you owe them the money. And this also, it's not just about sales and receipts, but for example, if you employ someone and they have a holiday entitlement, then that becomes that gets counted under accrual accounting, even though you haven't paid out any cash, because it's basically accrual accounting acts. If the organisation wound up at midnight tonight, what would be the end result? So all your obligations minus all your obligations, all the things that are owed to you, legally at that point. So it includes things that haven't yet been paid. So a legal obligation to pay holiday leave gets counted, and that's why accountants get very upset about people not taking their holiday leave, because it starts to make the accrued liabilities get bigger and bigger and bigger on the books. I always still feel like, well, if the person's actually going to take them, it doesn't really matter, but I'm not an accountant. And for other reasons, it's good for people to take their holidays regularly, so I don't object to that. But that's basically the difference. So in a sense, accrual accounting gives you a truer picture because it's all your obligations and all the things that are owed to you. But cash is what you've actually got in the bank. So the big advantage of cash is that you can match it to what you've literally got in the bank, and it should reconcile or match up. So you can double check that against your cash.
Can I ask you, how many organisations do you deal with who do the cash?
Yes.
Not many, I would think, these days.
Though what I've found is that a lot of organisations do cash month to month and accrual at the end of the year, or maybe quarterly at most. And there are some legal requirements if you're a registered charity about that as well. But so it is reasonably common to do cash accounting through the year on a month-by-month basis, or through the quarter on a month-by-month basis, and then once a quarter, get someone with the accounting nous, because it is a little bit complicated. There's a little extra degree of difficulty in accrual accounting that you need someone with some basic accounting skills. Though the accounting software has made a lot of that a lot easier than it used to be. So a big chunk of that can be automated. So that may disappear, that cash through the year and accrual at the end.
Well, it's more useful to be doing monthly cash or accrual.
Well, if your organisation is flying close to the whatever you fly close to, wind, sail, edge, then you almost always have to do cash, because you want to know, can I pay next fortnight's salary bill, or whatever. So with so when I've been in an organisation, last couple of years, an organisation I was in that I was on the board, we for a big chunk of 1 year were very close to just bouncing along the bottom because of a whole lot of things that I don't need to go into. But we knew we had to keep a really close eye on, and we did budgeting on the basis of cash as well. What do we expect to actually come in during that month? What do we expect to actually have to pay during that month? To make sure we had money in the bank, to make sure we were solvent, and we were less focused on the accrual if we could at least pay the cash.
I'm not happy with that, because if you're sailing close to the wind, you need to know what the total business.
You do need to know what the total.
Yeah, what the liabilities are,
yes, yeah.
rather than just the cash.
Yes, yeah, that is true. because we knew that there was a certain amount of income that was coming in at a different time, we knew we could survive in the medium term. So that's why we were less focused on that, and why we had to be. But we didn't have the cash in the bank. So that was a particular situation. But accrual is always the more accurate of your true position with all your obligations. In some cases it's required by law. So if you're a registered charity, there are 4 tiers of accounting standards that you need to meet. And if your annual operating expenditure is under $250,000, you can not only use a simple format, but you also can just use cash as your reporting. You don't have to do accrual. But once you get over that point, all the Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3, which are the bigger ones, you have to use accrual accounting and increasingly more complex reporting formats as well. And the idea there is that smaller money, there's less risk, so you don't want to spend so much time and energy making sure it's an absolutely accurate report when it's a relatively small amount of money. But once you get to $30 million annual operating expenses, you want to make sure it's using all the correct accounting rules. So you have to do all the full standards, meet all the full standards when you're at that level. Legally, that only applies if you're a registered charity, but it's become a kind of de facto standard, and the proposed amendments to the Incorporated Societies Act mean that it will, if they go through as they currently are proposed, will mean that the charity standards will apply to incorporated societies as well. So the de facto standard will become the actual standard for about 90% of non-profits that have some legal format. If you don't have any legal entity, then that doesn't apply. But, most of us are agreeing to either a charitable trust, incorporated society, or a charitable or non-profit company. Okay, yes. So, and we talked about the monitoring, we talked about restricted funds, we talked about cash versus accrual. And so now what we're going to do is have a look at an example of some financial statements. So I'll just hand these out to you. Half and half. So this is double-sided, and there are the 2 types of financial statements on each side. So just take one and pass it on to the table behind you. So one side looks like this, and the other side looks like that. Which is the front, which is the back, it depends how you turn it over in the first place. Okay, so one of them, one is a statement of financial something or other, and the other is a statement of financial something or other. So have a discussion with the other people at your table and see if you can agree which applies to which side of the page and what does the stand for. We have talked about these terms before, and they are on your colouring placemat if you need a prompt. Okay, so one side is position and the other side is performance. Your statement of position, your statement of performance. Which is which? So what's this one? It has total income and total expenditure and surplus deficit for the year. Which one is that? Performance? Everyone thinks so? Yes, well, fortunately you're all correct rather than all being wrong. So what does that mean? This one is statement of financial position. Yeah. So the position are what you're ending up with at the end of the year. So you'll see that underneath the title they're a slightly different subheading. One says, for the year ended, whatever it is, and the other one says, as at a certain date. So the statement of financial performance is for the whole year, so if it's the year ended, whatever a date, and the statement of financial position is at a particular single point of time, not for a whole year. So it's the difference really between stock and flow. So financial performance is like the flow, what comes in and what goes out, and financial position, I was hesitate, still not quite used to the terms. Financial position is the stock that's left in the cup after whatever flows in and out is taken into account. Have I confused you enough? That makes sense? Yep. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now then is to have a look at these two statements and tell me what questions, as if you were the board member of this organisation, that you might have if these financial statements were presented to you. So have a look at them, have a discussion at your table and see if there are any particular questions or issues that seem to come up when you look at these statements. So, again, I'm just going to press the pause button and give you another task which may help or may confuse you further. We'll soon find out. So I haven't got quite enough of these. Everyone. So what we'll do is 3s or 2s. What I want to do is, you'll see in financial position, there's liabilities and assets and some other things. So when you look at something, it's really important to be able to tell what's the difference between a liability and an asset. Not always straightforward. This is a kind of key accounting formula. There is a relationship between liabilities and assets and equity. So I'm going to give you some cards which say asset, liability, equity, a minus sign and an equal sign, and see if you can put them in the right order. Okay. So you can do these in 2s. Right, do you want to? Okay, people happy with their formula? So we'll just go through that first, then I'll give you some more time to go back and have a look at the statements because they are a little bit complicated. So liabilities are essentially what we're liable for, and assets are what we own, what we have, and equity is our net worth or our wherewithal. What's the difference between the two? So the formula relating those three things is what? Brave enough to
assets minus liabilities.
What a coincidence, that's what I had to. Yeah. So assets minus liability equals our equity. And equity is pretty much our solvency or our ability to continue as a going concern. It takes into account what we owe and what we own at any single point of time. But because it's a statement of position, it's only ever at any single point of time. So tomorrow it could be different. That's why if you have a contract with a standard contract with an accounting firm, if they do your annual financial performance reports, you as the board will need to say, and there's nothing that's happened since the end of the financial year that materially changes this, because every day or every hour it could technically give you a different result, because the financial position is only your position at a particular point in time. But it does give you that very important indicator, are we solvent? Can we still trade as a going concern? Okay, so go back to your the two financial statements, performance and position, and see if any more you can discover about this organisation or questions you want to ask. So if we just start at this statement of financial position, it all sounds simple until you actually look at a set of figures, isn't it? You'll see that the top three lines kind of summarise what happened through the year. So they started the year with 8,896, which is what they finished the year with last year, so that's nice. Start the year with what we finished last year. They had a surplus of 82,000, so therefore they've got accumulated funds of 91,000 in the bank. Does that make sense so far? The previous year they actually had they started the year with 28 and had a loss, so they went from accumulated funds of 28,000 down to 8,000. So it's a big shift. So if you wanted to ask what's happened here that we made such a reasonable size loss last year and we made a massive surplus this year. If you look at those accumulated funds and add them to the current liabilities of 108, then you get the if you add them to the current assets of 116, you will get the total equity and liabilities of 199. So this is what's happened during the year. This is the liabilities here, and this is the assets here. So the assets are mainly cash in the bank, which is a very liquid asset, so that's a nice asset to have. But there's some quite big liabilities. 106 of the 108 liabilities is for hire purchase agreements that they've entered into. So the agreement must have gone over the financial year, and they've got this obligation in the following year. But you'll see that they've actually only got 83,000 in the bank. So let's hope that hire purchase liability doesn't come due in the first month or two of the financial year, or they'll be a few tens of thousands short of actually being able to pay it. Does that make sense so far?
So the accumulated funds is not what's in the bank?
No. The accumulated funds is just during the year. So what's just what that current? Yes. What that issue is? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So, what things did you want to ask questions about from looking at these two financial statements? What are the issues that came up for these board members?
The profit and costs.
Yep.
I see they've got grants to spend over $30,000. Now, what do they get the grants for? Because normally when you get a grant for expenditure, it's going to be expensed in the year.
Yes. Yeah.
And if it's not, the surplus should be carried forward into the balance sheet, which means that that profit figure could be wrong.
Yes, yes. So make you suspect that surplus is not actually a surplus at all, and it's actually an obligation, because it's if it's a grant, it's probably restricted funds. You know, talking about restricted funds.
Yes, but still, in my view, the total grant shouldn't be in the profit loss.
That's right. Yes, yes. It could very well be an error.
Yeah, I think so.
Unless it's a very unusual grant.
This was all used for the.
All used in the year. Yeah.
No, hang on, appropriate, because the expenses for the year are very high. So the grant has not
That's
been
true.
totally expensed.
And your other account is much.
So it wasn't accountable in this.
Yes, it can't have all been used. There must be at least some error. But they did spend 651,000. I think, is that right? During the year. That's actual expenses. Yes. Yeah. And they spent 34,000 on motor vehicles and finance costs, as well as having this hire purchase liability of 106,000 at the end of the year. So that's a lot of car leasing. So I think they suddenly became the New Zealand's biggest leaser of cars. And they do also have a big increase in salaries.
Yes.
So but it's nowhere near the same level of increase. It's 155 to 409. Volunteer costs are pretty much the same. Training has gone up a little bit, but there's more than doubling of wages, but there's this massive increase in lease costs. So obviously they've all become mobile all of a sudden, and that's a new part of their operating model. But it's put them at big risk because they've got this very big liability. So you want to know, is there a guarantee that the grant will be renewed? Or is it at least highly likely? Because we've got to pay that liability somehow or other in the following year. Any other questions that people have? On either of the two statements, or looking at them together.
Liability added 199.
Sorry, why was the
equity and liability added to the equal 199?
That's a strange thing to do. I'm not an accountant, but I'm not familiar with usually doing that. But this is from an actual organisation, so they did it. The liabilities in total are 108. If you look at the figure above, so it hasn't got its own subheading, but that's the actual current liabilities, the 108 figure. So so if I was on the board, I would want to say, why don't we highlight that?
Yeah.
Instead of putting together equity and liabilities, two parts of our equation. You
can't add, one's a positive, one's a negative.
Yes, yeah.
To be a positive.
Yeah.
But it's completely mistaken.
Yeah. Yep. So I've got no idea what was behind it. There may be some sound accounting reason, but it's something I'm totally unfamiliar with. Certainly I would ask questions about it.
So I'd be asking why they've got it set that way. So
Yes.
Why are the assets not listed in the liabilities outlining equity?
Yes. Yeah.
It's so difficult to find which is which, and it's not clear.
So there is a usual convention that assets appear before liabilities, and then at the bottom you have the result of the two, so that's your equity. And within assets and liabilities, that you list them by degree of liquidity. So the liquidity just means how easy is it to turn into cash. So if it's cash in a bank, that's the most liquid. If it's a bricks and mortar building, that's one of the less liquid. So you would usually they are listed in that in the order of decreasing liquidity.
So from here, there is, you can work out equity. It looks like it's about 100,000.
Yes.
But it takes a long time. It took me a while to figure that out. Because of the way it's laid out.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not very clear for a board to talk about any financial understanding.
Well, I don't know whether the equity is 100,000. I would think. I think the equity might be 80,000.
Well, I was looking at if I'm running the formula to assets,
Yeah.
this liabilities.
So it's 116.
116.
Oh no, plus the 83, sorry. You're right, that's what I meant.
No,
So
it's
that's
199. 199. It's confusing, it's nothing like that. So it's 91, which is the accumulated funds, plus 116, which is fixed assets.
That's right, yes.
Less the liabilities of 108.
Yep, you're right, yes. Yeah. But you have to dig to find that. So it's not very clear.
And even now, I wouldn't be that sure.
Yep.
I'll pull out the big four words.
Yeah, I don't get it. Yep. That's the correct answer. Any other things that people noticed in here or that struck them? I mean, obviously there's been a big increase in income and it's all come from grants. We want to know what is that about? Have we suddenly become flavour of the month, or are we doing money laundering for a funder, or?
I think the board would know yourself if it's
Hopefully,
implementing, you know,
yes,
the
yeah.
change in the
Yeah.
organisation. But
Yep.
if you looked at
And how long term is this? Is it likely just to be a one-off? We've entered into these lease agreements, which are ongoing obligations, at least for another year, by the looks of it. So we need to check that against it.
One of the problems I've got with this is the situation that we get to. You were saying before that we thought we were getting a lot of money left over.
Yes.
And that they was profit of something over $1,000. But they've also got now fixed assets have gone up from 20,000 to 110,000. Okay, so they've actually transferred some of that grant that they've got into assets. So they've still got it as basically as money, even though they haven't spent it. And so if you look at the cash flow or look at the cash situation, they've received over 700,000 for grants.
Yeah.
They've paid out all the wages, all the expenses, plus they've bought the stuff, the extra 9,000 of the stuff. They've actually got rid of all the cash, but they're still showing a profit of 80,000 on a cash basis. Of what's in the bank, there's no real deal wrong.
No.
Yep, I think that's the case. Yes.
80,000 deal wrong. Well, they are 80,000 year off, but we were talking about a couple of 100,000. They didn't spend the ground.
But there's a tendency to look to the bottom line, literally, but the bottom line is not the bottom line. The bottom line is the middle line.
The problem is the way these are done is that it's all right for the board to understand all this, but they would present this to the members, and the members would look at that bottom line and, oh, we're really low.
Yes.
Whereas within 3 months they could be insolvent.
Yes, yeah.
Things at $2 billion next year.
And the next question is, why not knowing when things going down, if you're making a profit?
Yes, yeah.
Very
And I'm glad they've got a note next to the fixed assets because, what are these 116,000? The cars are obviously leased. Have they got other cars they've bought as well? Have we become a motor car lot? Uber, it could be Uber. But it doesn't. Yes. Yeah.
They also have to hand it over against the grants.
Yes, yeah.
So, to understand these, you need extra funds.
Yes, yeah. And some of this might make sense if you ask the question, the answer might explain it. There are some layout questions that can confuse, but it shows the importance of asking questions and of being able to look carefully at the figures and not just assume the bottom lines, figuratively or literally. Any other comments that we haven't picked up yet? Okay, well done. So the through there. There's the last two functions we can do very quick, relatively quickly, because we're not going to go into the details. So it's not that they're any less important, but they are very specific. And the second last area is having the proper controls in place. And there are a range of different controls that you might need to have in place. The best kind of summary of those is this, which comes from the Charity Commission that is from England and Wales. And this is the table of contents of their, it's a single page, going to a single page. But if you would like the whole document, I'm very happy to email it to you, but I don't want to print I think it's about an 80-page document for people to just put into their recycling. But these are the kind of topics that are covered in the checklist of internal financial controls that the UK or England and Wales Charity Commissioners recommend. And so they've grouped them under general monitoring arrangements, but in particular under income. So how do we have appropriate financial controls for income, various forms of income, and how do we have appropriate controls for purchases and payments, and how do we have appropriate controls for assets and investments. And like most things that we've talked about tonight, the answer to those questions will depend especially on size. So the bigger the organisation, the more complex and thorough the controls you will need to have, and the smaller the organisation, the more you can get away with less rigorous controls. One of the basic means of having a control in place is separation of powers or separation of responsibilities, so that there's always more than one person who has to approve the different parts of any single transaction. But in smaller organisations, that becomes very hard to do, or it becomes the same two people who are doing everything. And when you've only got two people doing anything, it's still always open to collusion. So I just want to finish up by the chart I showed before. I just want to talk a little bit about fraud and audit, and I won't say anything about reporting, just that you need to do it. That's the final step, which is to report to stakeholders. In 2016, there was a reasonable sized survey of fraud among not-for-profit organisations. This depended on self-disclosure, so it has always limitations, but it was confidential, so people could say what they thought. The basic result was most people thought that if fraud agreed in their organisation, it would be significant, if not catastrophic. Just on half said that fraud in the sector was a problem, but almost everyone thought it was not a problem in their organisation. So this is what's called the error of the optimism bias. So if you ask any group of people, are you average, below average, or above average on anything, for example, driving skills, about 80% of people will be above average, which of course is statistically not possible. People overestimate their skills, they overestimate that they've got adequate controls in place, and for prevention. 43% said prevention was important, but only 29% actually had it. So again, what we say and what we do is not the same. Only a third of us do background checks on new employees, and below a third on volunteers. And often in small organisations, lots of people have access to a wide range of financial transactions. most people, the reason they thought it wasn't a problem in their organisation was because they employed trustworthy people. You know, I know them, I trust them. They also thought the organisation had a good culture. 55% said they had an external auditor and they hadn't said anything was a problem. And half had some internal audit function. So these are mostly reasonably sizable organisations to have an internal audit function. And half said they had good internal controls, and 90% said they had a fraud, specifically a fraud control policy in place. But as I said, it actually is much more common than people's confidence would suggest. So that just in the people doing the survey, over $3 million in fraud was reported. The average fraud was $23,000. And just over half of those who were defrauded had a code of conduct, and even 80% of them had the fraud control plan, which they thought would solve things. Typical fraudster is over 50, paid employee in a non-accounting role, and is also more likely to be a woman and more likely to be in your organisation for more than 10 years. So I know all those women who've been there for more than 10 years and are over the age of 50, they're the big risk factor. I don't think that's what they were suggesting. But essentially, that it's often the least likely people. So if you think you can guess likely fraudsters, you're probably wrong. Collusion happened in a third of the cases, especially in the large, in a third of the large fraud cases, and in just under a third, it was a board member was involved in that collusion. And of the large frauds, so that's the over the 22,000, above the average, it's it most commonly occurred through cash theft. So that's our most vulnerable when we're handling cash. That's why accountants always these days like to sign off saying, but we've got no way of ensuring that that all cash is accounted for. In most organisations we don't, and that's the result. More than half of the respondents don't report fraud to the police because they're worried about reputation or impact on future funding. So basically, fraudsters mostly go unpunished or with minimal punishment, and they just get moved to other organisations. So we're not doing ourselves or our sector any favours in that policy. So some people think, well, that's what we get an audit for. Doesn't that solve all those problems? I've made a personal challenge, and I've spoken to groups of accountants and auditors, and I've not yet, no one has yet taken me up on this challenge, that I have not found an example where an audit discovered fraud. Full stop. Where frauds occur, they're either so big they're obvious, you know, where is that $100,000, like what was here a minute ago, or there's an external whistleblower, or a combination of the two. So the relying on external audit as to prevent or even detect fraud is mainly a ceremonial role, doesn't actually seem to have much of an actual effect on that. There may be other reasons why we want to do an audit, but as our fraud control strategy, it's not very effective. And audits these days have more and more provisos and say, well, you know, we don't guarantee this, we can't guarantee that. That's because auditors started getting sued, so they just, the way they dealt with that was just by saying, limiting more and more their liability of what they were saying in audits. And from some other research, not the same research, we know that if you're a not-for-profit, you get the least qualified and least experienced staff doing your audit, and they spend less time than average, even for commercial organisations your size. So, so basically, we get the poorest deal, often because we also pay the poorest prices. We either expect the audit to be free or cheap or below market prices, and we get what we pay for. It's basically the outcome of that. So if audits don't find fraud, generally they're even less likely to find it in a not-for-profit. The least senior staff spending less time on it, and there'll be less partner time overseeing what's going on. Oh, sorry, I missed something. Oh, yeah, so this is what the audit opinion does do. Gives an independent view of the accounts and states, given what's presented, with all the limitations of time, and given that they look at a sample of things, the accounts are probably in order, and they probably reflect what's going on. So it's just a statement of probability. You can get more thorough audits, so if you did really suspect something, you can get a forensic audit, which does go into more detail, and the cost explodes forensically with the forensic audit. 30, 50, 60, 100,000 is what you kind of start to pay. So if you're a $20,000 organisation, you can soon see that it doesn't make sense. Even if you're a $100,000 organisation, it wouldn't make sense as a regular entity in any case. So we need to have a look at the control mechanisms we have in place. That's really the only way to realistically have any sensible impact on the chance that fraud will be less likely to occur. And again, charities, if you're a registered charity, there are some legal requirements about auditing. So if you are a registered charity and you've got expenditure of more than $1 million, you must be audited. Between $500,000 and $1 million, you must be reviewed, which is like an audit light or a mini audit. It's cheaper, quicker, and less thorough than what we already said was not very thorough. But it does give some external verification that someone outside the organisation has at least popped their head in the window and looked around to see if there was anything obviously bad going on. And less than 500,000, you can choose whether you do anything. You might just have your accounts compiled by an external auditor, so that there's some independence, or an external accountant. That's a bingo, by the way, I think. Yes, that's it, yeah.
You mentioned the qualified accountant not actually an auditor in the top one.
Yes, I think that's the requirement. Yeah. Now you may be down it. I'll have a look. It'll be on the charity's website, but I'm pretty sure that's where I got it from. I can't imagine why I would have got it from somewhere else.
I think he would have qualified would mean with the chartered accountants.
Yes, I think that's what
Not
it's
just
supposed to.
qualified.
No.
But they're not. But the chartered accountant's not an auditor.
Yes. 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 So the big lesson here is that audits have many functions, but preventing fraud is not one of them. We need to have other mechanisms in place if we're serious about that, and that's the controls that we talked about. My one-page summary of this 200-page document, it refers to organisations understanding their risks, so thinking about what are the things that could go wrong, where is fraud most likely to happen, segregating duties or separation of powers, as I talked about before, creating and monitoring key management reports by having your budget versus your expenditure and other reports. Occasionally doing the unexpected, like for example counting petty cash, or doing something that's not a normal part of the routine, because when things become part of the routine, they can be planned around. Establishing a whistleblower policy. Whistleblowing is the best way of revealing fraud. and also whistleblowers are always treated atrociously by organisations, so we need to change that equation, I think. And control assets with different layers of protection through stock takes, different access levels and things like that. Knowing your people and doing background checks, not just trusting them because they look nice. And finally, doing our bit for the sector as a whole by reporting fraud. So that's the only way people will actually get stopped, less likely to repeat. And most fraudsters are repeat offenders in any field, including in organisational fraud. So we need to gird our loins and admit that we were the victim of fraud, tell people what we've put in place to make sure it never happens again, but follow it up to make sure that people are held accountable for fraud rather than just moving on to some other organisation where they can repeat it. Okay, so that's it. The reporting needs to be done, and I just want to mention that our last session